Reconstruction had ended. But the struggle for equality did not. The Constitution promised freedom, it promised citizenship, it promised equal protection under the law. Yet, as federal troops withdrew from the South, enforcement quietly disappeared. Rights remained written on paper, but protection faded in practice. Across the former Confederate states, a new system began to take shape. Not through open rebellion, not through chains, but through laws, court decisions, and everyday rules that reshaped American life. Segregation did not arrive overnight. It was built slowly, deliberately, and legally, step by step. And so a new question came to define the era. How did segregation become law in a nation that had just abolished slavery? The end of Reconstruction creates a power vacuum. In 1877, Reconstruction came to a quiet but decisive end. As part of a political compromise in Washington, federal troops were withdrawn from the southern states. These soldiers had been the final line of protection for Reconstruction governments and for the civil rights of newly freed African Americans. Once they left, federal authority in the South weakened almost immediately. Without military support, Reconstruction governments began to collapse. Republican-led state governments, many of them supported by black voters, were overthrown through intimidation, fraud, and political pressure. In state after state, officials who had supported Reconstruction were forced from office or rendered powerless. Power quickly shifted back to white Democratic leaders, often called redeemers, who promised to restore order and local control. Many of these leaders had openly opposed Reconstruction from the beginning. Their return marked a dramatic reversal of the political changes that had followed the Civil War. At the national level, the federal government abandoned active enforcement of civil rights. Congress passed fewer protections, and federal courts became increasingly reluctant to intervene in state affairs. Although the 14th and 15th Amendments remained part of the Constitution, their enforcement was inconsistent and weak. This retreat created a dangerous vacuum. Where federal authority faded, state and local governments filled the space, often with policies designed to exclude and control. Violence had been a powerful tool during Reconstruction, but now it was increasingly replaced by law. Southern states began crafting legal systems of discrimination. Instead of open terror alone, segregation and exclusion were written into statutes, regulations, and everyday practices. What had once been enforced through intimidation was now enforced through courts, police, and public institutions. This transition was crucial. By transforming inequality into law, segregation gained legitimacy and permanence. It allowed discrimination to operate openly, predictably, and with the appearance of legality. The end of Reconstruction did not restore peace, it reshaped power. And in the space left behind, a new system emerged, one that would define American life for decades to come. What Jim Crow really means. The term Jim Crow did not begin as a law. It began as a performance. In the early 19th century, Jim Crow was the name of a fictional character created in blackface minstrel shows. These performances mocked African Americans through exaggerated stereotypes, presenting them as inferior, uneducated, and comical. Though entertainment at the time, these portrayals reinforced racist attitudes and helped normalize inequality in American culture. Over time, the meaning of Jim Crow changed. What began as a stage caricature became shorthand for an entire system of racial separation and discrimination. By the late 1800s, Jim Crow described a growing body of laws and customs designed to separate black and white Americans in nearly every aspect of public life. To understand this system, it is important to distinguish between de facto and de jure segregation. De facto segregation refers to separation that occurs in practice without being written into law. It often results from economic inequality, social customs, or private discrimination, such as housing patterns or employment practices. De jure segregation, by contrast, is segregation enforced by law. Under Jim Crow, separation was mandated by state and local governments. Schools, transportation, restrooms, hospitals, and public spaces were legally divided by race, with penalties for those who violated the rules. Segregation became normalized through repetition and routine. Children grew up learning which spaces they were allowed to enter and which they were forbidden from using. Signs, regulations, and social expectations made racial separation feel ordinary and unavoidable. Local authorities enforced segregation through police, courts, and bureaucratic systems. Because these rules were legal, challenging them was dangerous and often futile. Discrimination became embedded in daily life, shaping behavior, opportunity, and identity. Although Jim Crow is most closely associated with the Deep South, its influence extended far beyond it. Northern and Western states practiced forms of segregation through housing discrimination, employment exclusion, and unequal schooling. While not always codified in the same way, racial separation existed across the nation. Jim Crow was not simply a Southern problem, it was a national one. It reflected a broader retreat from Reconstruction's promise of equality and a willingness to accept inequality as normal. By transforming prejudice into policy, Jim Crow reshaped American society, and once embedded in law and custom, it would take decades to challenge. Segregation written into law. Segregation did not exist only as custom or tradition. It was written, deliberately, into law. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Southern states passed hundreds of statutes that mandated racial separation. These laws touched nearly every part of daily life: schools, railroads, streetcars, housing, restaurants, hospitals, parks, and even cemeteries. Public education became one of the clearest examples. States required separate schools for black and white children, claiming the arrangement was fair and lawful. In reality, the separation was never equal. This contradiction was formally sanctioned in 1896 when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson. The court declared that racial segregation was constitutional as long as facilities were separate but equal. In theory, this phrase suggested fairness. In practice, it legalized inequality. Black schools received a fraction of the funding given to white schools. Buildings were overcrowded, poorly maintained, and often lacked basic supplies. Teachers were underpaid, textbooks were outdated, and school terms were shorter, sometimes by months. The law allowed these disparities to continue without challenge. The same pattern existed beyond education. Public transportation placed black passengers in inferior rail cars or forced them to stand. Hospitals either segregated patients or denied care altogether. Public spaces were divided with signs that made exclusion visible and permanent. Enforcement of segregation did not require constant violence. It relied on local authorities, police officers, judges, school boards, and clerks who ensured compliance. Violating segregation laws could result in fines, arrest, or worse. The message was clear. Obedience was expected. Resistance was punished. Over time, segregation shaped more than institutions. It shaped the human mind. Being labeled legally inferior affected self-perception, ambition, and identity. Children learned early that the law itself considered them unequal. The psychological weight of this message carried across generations. Segregation was not accidental, and it was not temporary. It was a carefully constructed legal system designed to preserve racial hierarchy. And because it was enforced by law, dismantling it would require more than moral arguments. It would require national confrontation. Voting rights systematically destroyed. Political power was the next target. After Reconstruction ended, Southern leaders understood one truth clearly. As long as Black Americans could vote, the system of segregation could be challenged. So instead of openly violating the Constitution, they found ways to work around it. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, prohibited denying the right to vote based on race. On paper, Black men were citizens with political power. In practice, states built a maze of barriers designed to exclude them, legally. One of the most common tools was the poll tax. Voters were required to pay a fee before casting a ballot. For poor citizens, especially formerly enslaved people, this cost alone made voting impossible. Failure to pay often accumulated over time. permanently blocking access to elections. Next came literacy tests. Voters were asked to read and interpret complex sections of state constitutions. White voters were often given simple questions or exempted entirely. Black voters faced impossible standards, judged arbitrarily by local officials. The test was not about literacy. It was about control. Then came the grandfather clause. These laws allowed citizens to vote only if their grandfathers had voted before the Civil War. Since Black Americans had been enslaved and denied voting rights at that time, the exclusion was total. The law never mentioned race, but its purpose was unmistakable. Another powerful weapon was the white primary. Southern states declared that political parties were private organizations. Because the Democratic Party dominated the South, excluding black voters from its primaries effectively removed them from meaningful elections altogether. The Supreme Court would not strike this down until the mid-20th century. Together, these measures devastated black political participation. By the early 1900s, black voter turnout in many southern states dropped from majority levels to near zero. Black elected officials disappeared from legislatures, city councils, and Congress. All of this was accomplished through constitutional loopholes. States claimed they were regulating voting, not discriminating. Federal courts often accepted this reasoning, choosing narrow legal interpretation over justice. What emerged was a democracy in name only. Voting rights existed in theory, but power was stripped in practice. The promise of citizenship had been hollowed out, quietly, systematically, and with the full weight of the law. Violence and intimidation enforced the system. Laws alone were not enough to enforce segregation. Violence filled the gaps where legislation ended. Across the South, lynching became a tool of terror, public, deliberate, and meant to send a message. Thousands of black men, women, and children were murdered without trial, often accused of minor or fabricated offenses. These acts were not spontaneous. They were organized, announced in advance, and witnessed by entire communities. The purpose was clear: to remind Black Americans that challenging the racial order could cost them their lives. The justice system failed completely. Local courts rarely investigated lynchings. Sheriffs and judges often participated directly or turned away knowingly. All white juries refused to indict perpetrators, even when evidence was overwhelming. Justice was not absent. It was deliberately withheld. Compounding this violence was media silence and normalization. Many newspapers ignored lynchings entirely or described them in neutral, detached language. Victims were blamed. Perpetrators were portrayed as protecting community values. Over time, terror became routine, reported without outrage, explained without condemnation. Law enforcement played a critical role in sustaining the system. Police officers enforced segregation laws aggressively while refusing to protect black citizens from violence. Arrests were selective. Protection was conditional. In many communities, the presence of a badge signaled not safety, but threats. Facing constant danger, many black families made a painful choice. They left. This movement became known as the Great Migration. Beginning in the late 19th century and accelerating during World War I, millions of Black Americans fled the South for northern and western cities. They sought safety, jobs, and dignity, things denied to them at home. Migration was not opportunity alone, it was survival. But leaving came at a cost. Families were separated, communities were fractured, and the violence that drove them away remained unchallenged. Through terror, silence, and complicity, segregation was enforced not just by law, but by fear. A fear designed to be seen, remembered, and never questioned. The Supreme Court legalizes inequality. In 1896, segregation received its most powerful protection, not from mobs or local laws, but from the highest court in the nation. The case was Plessy v. Ferguson. Homer Plessy, a New Orleans resident who was legally classified as black, challenged Louisiana's law requiring segregated railroad cars. He argued that forced separation violated the 14th Amendment, which promised equal protection under the law. The Supreme Court disagreed. In a 7-1 decision, the court ruled that racial segregation was constitutional, as long as facilities were separate but equal. With those 3 words, the court created a legal foundation for inequality that would last for more than half a century. In theory, separate but equal suggested fairness. In reality, it was a legal illusion. Facilities designated for Black Americans were consistently inferior. Underfunded schools, overcrowded transportation, poor public services, and limited access to healthcare. Equality existed only on paper, never in practice. The ruling had long-term consequences far beyond railroads. States used Plessy as justification to segregate nearly every aspect of life: education, housing, public accommodations, employment, and even cemeteries. Segregation became not just permitted, but protected by law. The decision also signaled a retreat by the federal government from civil rights enforcement. Washington no longer challenged discriminatory state laws. Courts stopped intervening. The burden of resistance fell almost entirely on those being oppressed. One justice dissented. Justice John Marshall Harlan warned that the decision would become as damaging as the infamous Dred Scott ruling. He declared that the Constitution was colorblind, a statement ignored at the time but remembered later. Through Plessy versus Ferguson, inequality gained legitimacy. Segregation was no longer simply a social custom or local practice. It was now embedded in American law, enforced by courts, upheld by government, and shielded from challenge. Justice had not failed by accident. It had been redefined. Life under Jim Crow. For Black Americans, Jim Crow was not an abstract system of laws. It was a daily reality, felt in classrooms, workplaces, hospitals, and public spaces. Education was deliberately unequal. Black schools received a fraction of the funding given to white schools. Buildings were overcrowded, books were outdated or discarded. Teachers were underpaid, yet often deeply committed to their students. Despite the obstacles, education remained a source of pride and resistance, a belief that knowledge could still open doors the law had closed. Employment options were sharply limited. Most Black workers were confined to low-wage labor, farming, domestic service, railroad work, or industrial jobs with the most dangerous conditions. Sharecropping and tenant farming trapped families in cycles of debt that closely resembled economic bondage. Contracts were enforced unfairly, and leaving a job could result in arrest or violence. Housing was segregated by both law and practice. Black neighborhoods were overcrowded and neglected by city services. Infrastructure was poor. Sanitation was minimal. Home ownership was discouraged through discriminatory lending and local ordinances. Where you lived determined the quality of your life and the limits placed upon it. Healthcare inequality cost lives. Black patients were often denied treatment at white hospitals or relegated to poorly funded facilities. Medical training programs excluded Black doctors. Preventable diseases spread in communities denied basic care. Life expectancy was shorter, not by chance, but by design. Everyday life was marked by social restrictions and constant humiliation. Black Americans were required to step aside on sidewalks, avoid eye contact, and use separate entrances. A mistake in tone or posture could provoke arrest, or worse. Jim Crow demanded not only separation, but submission. Yet within this system, resilience endured. Black churches became centers of leadership, education, and hope. They organized schools, mutual aid societies, and political movements. Black colleges and universities trained teachers, doctors, and future leaders. Families passed down dignity, history, and resistance, even when public life denied them all 3. Survival under Jim Crow was not passive. It was an act of endurance, an insistence on humanity in a society determined to deny it, resistance and survival. Jim Crow sought to control every aspect of life, but it never fully succeeded. Even under constant pressure, Black Americans resisted, adapted, and built institutions that kept hope alive. Black-owned businesses and institutions became pillars of survival. Barbershops, grocery stores, banks, insurance companies, and newspapers served communities shut out of the white economy. These businesses provided jobs, financial independence, and safe spaces. They proved that dignity could exist even when denied by law. Resistance also took organized form. Early civil rights activism emerged long before the modern movement of the 1950s and 1960s. Leaders challenged segregation through petitions, boycotts, and lawsuits. Organizations like the NAACP, founded in 1909, used the legal system itself to fight injustice, case by case, court by court. Legal challenges to segregation slowly chipped away at Jim Crow. Lawyers targeted unequal education, voting restrictions, and discriminatory housing laws. Victories were limited and often ignored, but each case established a record, a paper trail of resistance that would matter later. Black newspapers and educators played a critical role. Journalists documented lynchings when white papers remained silent. They exposed injustice, named perpetrators, and connected communities across states. Teachers preserved history and identity, reminding students that segregation was not natural, it was constructed. These efforts laid the foundations of the civil rights movement. They built leadership, legal strategies, and national networks. When mass protest finally emerged in the mid-20th century, it did not begin from nothing. It stood on decades of quiet courage, preparation, and persistence. Resistance under Jim Crow was not always loud. Sometimes it was a business that refused to close, a classroom that kept teaching, a newspaper that kept printing the truth. Survival itself became a form of defiance. The Great Migration. By the early 20th century, millions of Black Americans reached a difficult conclusion. If justice could not be found in the South, it would have to be searched for elsewhere. This movement became known as the Great Migration, one of the largest internal migrations in American history. The push factors were powerful and relentless. Jim Crow laws enforced segregation. Voting rights were stripped away. Economic opportunities were limited to exploitative labor. Violence, including lynching, remained a constant threat. For many families, leaving was not a choice. It was an act of survival. At the same time, pull factors drew people north and west. Industrial cities needed workers, especially during World War I, when immigration from Europe declined. Factories in Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, New York, and Philadelphia offered wages. Modest, but paid in cash. Northern cities promised better schools, political participation, and at least some protection under the law. The migration reshaped American culture. New communities formed, bringing music, literature, religion, and political activism with them. The Harlem Renaissance emerged from this movement, influencing art, language, and identity nationwide. Black voters gained political influence in northern cities, changing local and national elections. The economic impact was significant. Black workers helped power American industry, while new businesses and institutions strengthened urban neighborhoods. At the same time, overcrowding and discrimination followed migrants north, creating new challenges rather than ending old ones. American cities were permanently transformed. Urban landscapes changed. Neighborhoods formed around shared experience and resilience. But segregation did not disappear. It adapted, taking new forms through housing discrimination and economic inequality. The Great Migration revealed an uncomfortable truth. Jim Crow was not just a Southern system. Its consequences spread nationwide, shaping race relations, politics, and inequality across the entire country. Movement offered hope, but it did not erase injustice. It carried it into a new chapter of American history. The cracks begin to show. By the early 20th century, the system of segregation appeared solid, but beneath the surface, it was beginning to fracture. World wars changed expectations. During World War I and especially World War II, Black Americans served in uniform, fought overseas, and labored in defense industries at home. They returned with a sharpened question. How could a nation fight for democracy abroad while denying it at home? Military service challenged old assumptions. Black veterans demanded the rights they had defended. Their experience fueled new confidence and new impatience with second-class citizenship. At the same time, legal challenges to segregation intensified. Civil rights organizations, particularly the NAACP, pursued carefully planned court cases. Rather than attacking segregation all at once, they targeted its weakest points: unequal education, unfair housing policies, and discriminatory employment practices. Each case built upon the last, creating a legal strategy designed to dismantle separate but equal. The federal government slowly began to re-engage. During World War II, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued an executive order banning racial discrimination in defense industries. While limited, it marked an important shift. Washington was no longer entirely absent from civil rights enforcement. Public awareness also grew. Photographs, journalism, and first-hand accounts exposed the contradictions of American democracy. Segregation could no longer be hidden behind legal language or regional custom. The issue was becoming national and increasingly international, as global audiences watched America's treatment of its own citizens. These developments created momentum toward change. The Jim Crow system had not collapsed, but its legitimacy was weakening. Laws were being questioned, silence was breaking, resistance was becoming organized, strategic, and impossible to ignore. The cracks were small, but history rarely changes all at once. What mattered was that they had appeared, America's long detour. Jim Crow did not appear by accident. It emerged as a replacement for Reconstruction, a way to preserve power after slavery was abolished and federal protection was withdrawn. Where Reconstruction had promised equality, Jim Crow enforced control. The most powerful weapon was not violence alone, but law. Courts, legislatures, and local authorities transformed discrimination into policy. Segregation, disenfranchisement, and inequality were not failures of democracy. They were choices made within it. For decades, democracy was delayed, not erased. The Constitution remained. Rights were written on paper, but enforcement disappeared, allowing injustice to operate behind legal language and procedure. This era still matters because its consequences never fully ended. Modern inequalities in education, housing, wealth, and political access did not begin in the present. They were shaped here. Jim Crow structured opportunity, limited mobility, and defined who could fully participate in American life. Understanding this history is not about assigning guilt. It is about recognizing how systems evolve and how easily freedom can retreat when protection fades. In the next video, we will follow the story forward. We will see how resistance becomes movement, how courtrooms turn into battlegrounds, and how ordinary people force a nation to confront its contradictions. Because America's long detour did not end quietly. It ended when people refused to accept delay any longer. Thank you for watching. If you found this piece of history compelling, please like this video and subscribe for more stories that shaped our world.